When my twins were born, I had a boy and a girl, Rachel and Daniel, and Daniel's development started off a bit slow, but we'd never had a boy in the family, and I know boys are always slower, and thought he's a twin, so we'd just start to worrying about him not reaching the next step, and then he'd catch up, and again that would happen. But by 18 months it was pretty obvious that something was wrong, that he was delayed quite significantly. And we went to the paediatrician, and he thought for a long time, didn't say anything, which always made me worried, because when doctors don't say anything it's usually bad news. And he rang me back the next day and said he wanted to have the Fragile X test done. And I thought, well, my son doesn't have Fragile X, and you're just doing that because I'm a geneticist, but the test came back positive.
Who is it? Daniel Simpson, hi! How lovely to see you!
Cynthia Roberts' son, Daniel Simpson, is like most 18-year-old males. He has a messy bedroom, is attached to his electronic video games, and has recently graduated from high school. But, unlike the average 18-year-old male, Daniel has Fragile X syndrome. Fragile X syndrome, or Fragile X for short, is the world's most common genetic cause of developmental disability. In Australia, 1 child a week is born who is fully affected with Fragile X, and 20 other children are born who are carriers of the gene.
Everybody has the Fragile X gene, but the mutation that we associate with Fragile X syndrome is an expansion of the front part of the gene. So in a female who's a carrier of just a small expansion, or premutation as we call it, her other X is normal. So there's a 50-50 chance that she would pass on the mutated X to her children.
Men who carry the Fragile X premutation carry it on their X chromosome. So men have only one X and one Y chromosome. So if they pass their Y chromosome on, that's going to be to a son. They can never pass on Fragile X to their son, but they will always pass on the Fragile X gene to all of their daughters.
Those who are affected by the disability display severe social anxiety, a significant delay in early development skills such as speaking and walking, hypersensitivity to sensations such as noise and light, and poor motor skills. Many also display physical differences such as elongated ears, high foreheads, and flat feet. The cognitive symptoms often inhibit persons with Fragile X from leading a traditional lifestyle and often require full-time carers. There are 3 main issues that affect people who have Fragile X: the misdiagnosis of the disability, the lack of funding available to people with Fragile X, and perhaps the most concerning aspect, the fact that the average Australian has no idea what Fragile X actually is.
Do you know what Fragile X is?
No.
Do you know what Fragile X is?
No.
Do you know what Fragile X is?
Fragile what?
Do you know what Fragile X is?
What?
Do you know what Fragile X is?
No.
However, despite the many Australians who have not heard of Fragile X, there is someone in Melbourne who has dedicated the past 2 decades to understanding the disability. Neuroscientist Professor Kim Cornish from Monash University in Victoria is a world-leading expert in genetic disorders with a particular focus on Fragile X. Talking about the misdiagnosis of Fragile X, Professor Cornish says that there is a constant diagnostic confusion with Fragile X to autism.
Too many children are being misdiagnosed, and the main problem with that is that, firstly, diagnosis is then delayed, normally to, I think in the US, it's about 4 years for the age of first diagnosis if you don't have family members with Fragile X, and it will be probably, my guess is, slightly later here. And also you can't intervene early. There's similarities. The similarities are in the eye gaze. The similarities are sometimes in the repetition of words and phrases. But the actual mechanisms by which they get to the child with Fragile X has those behaviours is very different to the mechanisms by which the child with autism.
As indicated by Professor Cornish, the behavioural aspects of Fragile X are unique to the disability and cause an array of difficulties and challenges for those people who care for loved ones with the condition. Amy Simpson, Daniel's 22-year-old sister, says that despite the unconditional love for her brother, her entire family still struggle with the behavioural symptoms attached to Fragile X.
While people who aren't in our family, his teachers and people on the street might look at him and say, hey, he's really happy, so at the end of the day, what's so bad? You kind of don't see the flip side of that, and that is the tantrums and the toilet changing, which still goes on at age 18. His inability to talk very well, his inability to hold a pencil and write you a birthday card. You don't see the medical issues that are associated with that, so the seizures. I mean, he has auras, which are sort of like a miniature seizure at least once a week, with a major seizure occurring probably every 3 to 4 months. The medication, he has to take probably about half a dozen pills every morning and night.
The hardest is the behaviour. When he becomes overwhelmed, he just can't self-manage, and so he'll have tantrums or he'll drop to the floor and won't move. We've had occasions where he's dropped to the ground when we're crossing the road on a busy street and we just can't get him moving. Or he chatters a lot, so people don't understand, and they come up and tell you to be quiet in the cinema, and they'll be rude. And one time one woman told me to take him home and put him back in his cage.
And the Simpson family is not alone. Rachel Clements is the mother of 5 children and is also a carrier of Fragile X. 3 of her children are also carriers, and her 4.5-year-old son Michael was diagnosed with Fragile X 18 months ago. Rachel says that whilst it has been hard for Michael in having to cope with his disability, the diagnosis has also been very hard on her.
I think the most difficult thing out of getting the Fragile X diagnosis for our family has actually been on me. I was or am the main breadwinner in this family, so my salary was the main income earner, and Greg worked full-time as well. So we both worked full-time, we have a mortgage and all of that, and I think for me, all of a sudden having twins, which were a little bit unexpected. Then on top of that, about 6 months after I had them, 3 months after I had them, we got the diagnosis of Fragile X. So for me, all of a sudden my whole world just changed, and here I am with baby twins, plus trying to take him to different therapies, interventions, finding out specialist appointments, finding out what does this mean for our family.
Another challenge faced by people who have Fragile X is the lack of government funding available to them. The Honourable Andrew Constance, Minister for Disability Services, who was unavailable for television interview, stated that as research has indicated that early intervention best addresses outcomes for children with additional needs, accordingly, under the Commonwealth Government's Better Start program, funding is available for children aged under 6 who have been diagnosed with one of 13 specific syndromes, including Fragile X. Better Start provides up to $12,000 per child for early intervention support. But despite the $12,000 Better Start grant, parents say that the funding is not enough to support their children throughout the entirety of their life.
The issue I have is once we stop, once he gets to 7, there is nothing else that I'm aware of, except carer's allowance, which I do get that, but that's I think about $100 a fortnight or roughly. So unfortunately his speech therapy requirements won't cease when after 7. He'll still probably need weekly speech therapy at a cost of $80 plus every time. He probably still will need some occupational therapy. And also in terms of schooling, he's classified as mild intellectual disability, which means he basically doesn't get very much support at school, which he really, really needs. Who's going to pay for it? We're going to pay for it.
And, you know, for instance, I don't know what's going to happen to Dan when we die, where he'll live. There's no housing, there's no sort of facilities like there are aged care homes. You know, we just need more help.
And funding would not go amiss in the classroom either. Sophie Evans, a teacher at the Chalmers Road School for Children with a Disability, who teaches children with Fragile X, including Daniel Simpson, says that extra funding is needed in order to adequately provide for the children at the school.
Ultimately, these kids, I would love to give them all one-on-one attention every day. The funding doesn't allow for that, and that would be a really big ask to be able to do that, but if that was possible, that would make a huge difference and just give them some more individualised attention.
Professor Cornish says that the concerns surrounding the future for children and adults who have Fragile X can and should be addressed through sufficient training and stronger research, and Shadow Minister for Disability Services, Barbara Perry, echoes the alarming sentiments concerning the future for people with Fragile X, and says that the key to these concerns, whilst funding is imperative, is also in raising awareness of Fragile X.
We need to let people know about this because, you know, it could be one of your children that is born that has the syndrome, and you just don't know,
Working towards informing the Australian public is the Fragile X Association of Australia, a not-for-profit organisation. Psychologist Janie Roberts from the Fragile X Association Manly office says that a lack of general awareness about Fragile X means that families are unable to make informed decisions prior to a child being born or even conceived.
With awareness and knowledge comes power to make choices, and so, you know, there's been so many instances where people have not been aware, they've gone ahead, they've had children without perhaps, you know, sort of having any interventions, and then there's been a child who's fully affected with Fragile X, and it's very difficult for parents to see the struggles that, you know, usually their son maybe would have to go through.
As a carrier of the Fragile X gene, Amy Simpson has a 1 in 2 chance of passing on the disability, and says that while she loves her brother unconditionally, she would not conceive naturally so as to avoid having a child who is affected with Fragile X as a result of the struggle her family have gone through with Daniel.
So for me, I have a number of options, which means I can either have a natural pregnancy and take that risk, or I can go through the IVF programs that are available and do PGD testing, or I could have a child via surrogacy or adoption or some other means. At the same time, I really grieve for the fact that I won't be able to have children naturally if I want to guarantee that they won't have Fragile X, and to some extent it feels quite selfish. If my child did have Fragile X, I would blame myself. That would be all my fault.
The question turns to, is there a cure for Fragile X? Is it a lifetime disability?
You can't cure Fragile X, but what you can do is make the lives of the infants and the children and the adults with Fragile X, you can help them reach their potential. And we're in such a good place to do that now, because we know so much of what is happening across the years in Fragile X. There's so much more than we did a decade ago.
And making their children's lives better and standing up for their children is exactly what these families are doing.
Once you get a diagnosis of that your child has a disability, you know, all of those dreams, you know, in a way come crashing down, and it's very, very confronting. And I really hope that he can, you know, go out and get a job and, you know, be a contributing member of society. And I hope that all the work that I'm doing now in terms of early intervention will pave the way for him to have a great life.
You really want to protect your kids. We were at a dance concert once. Rach was in a dance concert, and Dan makes this sort of woo-woo sound when he's excited. So he's making this, and the adjudicator at the dance concert announces over the loudspeaker, "What is that noise?" So I stood up and said, "Well, that's my disabled son who's here to see his sister." And a few people applauded me.
For more information on Fragile X, the signs to look for in your children, and for any donations to the Fragile X Association, please go to the link below. Emma Bechara reporting.